Welcome everyone to History Gone Wilder, part of Half History Will Travel. I am your host, the Wilder Historian, and this episode starts a new biography series, one that covers one of the most controversial men that came out of the American Civil War, William Tecumseh Sherman. The Patreon members chose Sherman out of a list of 3 Union generals. If you'd like to vote in the next poll, join the Patreon page for as little as $1, and you can cast your ballot. It was November 1864, and a red-headed man with a scruffy beard sat atop his horse and marched his army away from the city of Atlanta, Georgia, as smoke lifted skyward from the war-torn city. The general had become a household name by that year of the American Civil War, but his next move would bring him even more fame and infamy as his army pushed toward the Georgia coast on his march to the sea. The man's name was William Tecumseh Sherman. Sherman's ancestors were pillars of the communities in which they resided. Taylor Sherman, William's grandfather, was born in 1758 and was active during the American Revolution. Once that conflict ended, Taylor was named Commissioner of the Western Reserve in Ohio from the state of Connecticut. Some of that land in Ohio would go to families in Connecticut who may have lost their homes during the Revolution. Taylor himself purchased land in Ohio after helping settle treaties to remove Native Americans from that district. Taylor had 3 children with his wife Betsy, 2 sons, Daniel and Charles, and a daughter, Betsy, named after her mother. Taylor's son Charles would become the father of William T. Sherman. Charles was born in Connecticut, attended Dartmouth College, and studied law with his father. He would marry Mary Sherman, and they would move to Ohio, hoping to settle on some of Charles' father's land. But fights with Native Americans resulted in him moving further south and settling in Lancaster, Ohio. Soon after moving his family to the town, the War of 1812 broke out. Charles delivered a major address at the militia enlistment meeting saying, "The crisis has arrived in which your country calls upon you, her constitutional guardians, to rally around her standard and to defend her rights and liberties." Charles's unit would see little action during the war, but President James Madison would appoint him the collector of the Internal Revenue for the 3rd District of Ohio. However, when inflation in the United States hit high levels, the government declared that they would only accept hard money or Bank of the United States notes for government obligations. This made much of the money in the United States worthless, at least in the payments to the federal government. Because of this declaration, Charles was left with stacks of worthless paper money, leaving him in critical debt. He sold property and borrowed, attempting to dig himself out of the financial hole, but was unable to do so, and he would continue to pay on his debts the rest of his life. Despite his financial struggles, Charles became a justice on the Ohio Supreme Court. Many prominent Americans of the 19th century stayed at his home, including DeWitt Clinton and Henry Clay. In that home, all but one of his 11 children were born. The 6th child, born on February 8, 1820, was named Tecumseh Sherman, known as Cump to his brothers and sisters. His name was strange in the early 19th century. His father gave him the name after the great Shawnee leader Tecumseh. Someone worked up the nerve to ask Charles about his son's name and why he had chosen it. Charles simply responded that Tecumseh was a great warrior. Cump's memories of his father were few, but he did remember when Charles would come home from riding the circuit. The first child to reach their father would get to ride back to the stable on the horse. Most of the time, Cump lost the foot race, but when he was about 6, he beat his brothers and sisters to greet his father. However, the horse would buck and throw Cump off its back, giving him a scar on his right cheek that he would carry for the rest of his life. On one occasion, Cump was reprimanded by his father, and he decided to run away from home to the house of a family friend. For several days, Cump lived with his friend, but when he found that none of his family was concerned over his leaving, he came back home. During one of Charles's rides on the circuit, he developed a high fever and became gravely ill. When the end was drawing near, Charles refused the services of a clergyman and instead asked for a funeral according to the Masonic rite. With the death of her husband, Mary Sherman worried about how to take care of her children. The death of Charles only left her with the house and its furnishings and a little bit of money, not enough to keep the family out of poverty. The youngest 3 children, all under the age of 4, would stay with their mother, but the rest would be sent to live with family, friends, and in the case of the older girls, would be married off. Cump wouldn't have to go far. He was taken in by their neighbor, Thomas Ewing. Sherman would live throughout his life being affected by his father's death, always concerned about being destitute or leaving his family impoverished as his father had done, and he strove to make sure that wouldn't happen. Thomas Ewing became a prominent man in Sherman's life. The burly Ewing had come to Ohio in its early settlement with his family, who lived a meager lifestyle, subsisting on wild game and eating it with the only utensils they possessed, sharpened sticks. Ewing thirsted for knowledge and at one point walked 40 miles just to get a book to read. He would go to work at a local salt works where he saved up enough money to go to college. He would study law and was eventually admitted to practice before the U.S. Supreme Court. His life as a lawyer led him into politics, where he became a prominent Whig politician, going on to become a U.S. Senator. Kump referred to Thomas as an intellectual giant, referring to his knowledge as well as his physical prowess. When Sherman moved into the house, there were already 7 children living there. 4 were Ewing's, and he was raising 3 nieces and nephews. Ewing's wife was a devout Catholic and insisted on Sherman's baptism into the faith for him to stay with the family. Mary Sherman agreed to the baptism, but when the priest came to baptize Sherman, the priest stated, since there was not a Saint Tecumseh, that Sherman needed a Christian name to add to his Indian name. Since it was St. William's Day, the priest anointed him William Tecumseh. As one of Sherman's biographers explained, these conditions of his entry into the Ewing family reinforced young Kump's natural anxiety, and although he had been baptized, he refused to call himself a Catholic or practice that creed. Perhaps he was modeling himself on Ewing, who never considered religion important, but more likely it was the legacy of his strained entry into the Ewing family. Although Ewing would be away when Congress was in session, he kept up a constant correspondence with the family, instructing his wife Maria to have the newly named William to read to the family from the 9 volumes of S.G. Goodrich's Peter Parley books. The volumes discussed geography, history, morality, order, and American superiority. It's believed that these readings stimulated William's reverence for the American Union. William and his foster brother Phil would watch the fire for Thomas when he would return to Lancaster and pull late-night sessions in his law office. Charles Sherman and Thomas Ewing helped put together the first school in Lancaster, so William was always encouraged to go to school. At one point, he had to attend an all-girls school because that was the only one available to him, but he would go on to attend a coeducational school where he acted up in class. One of the punishments doled out by the teacher was to put an upside-down wooden box on top of him. When Sherman attempted to whittle a peephole, the teacher paddled him. Despite his rambunctious ways, he excelled in school, learning Greek, Latin, and French, along with reading novels, Shakespeare, history, and travel books. Sherman would often help Ellen, his foster sister, with her arithmetic, and she began to see him as her protector. The boys of Lancaster also enjoyed playing a form of baseball with a yarn ball. Sherman and his friends would play, and sometimes they would knock the ball into the neighbor's garden. Annoyed at the boys, the neighbor would take his hatchet and cut up the ball. The boys then began putting a rock in the ball, and when the neighbor attempted to cut up the next ball, he broke his hatchet. Then the neighbor began to just throw the ball into the stove, so the boys put gunpowder in it. When the neighbor threw it in the stove, an explosion went up. The startled man chased after the boys and caught one of them and thrashed the young man. As a young man, Sherman detested his red hair because one of his foster brothers called him a red-haired woodpecker. But when he learned the rumor that Native Americans liked to scalp red-headed boys, he wore it as a symbol of defiance. In the summer, a sister of Thomas Ewing would look after the children, but on Sundays, she would lock Sherman and Phil in the parlor and make them read a chapter of the Bible before they would be released. The 2 boys searched for the shortest chapter, but then realized the searching was taking longer than actually reading a chapter, so they quickly read and then were released to play.